Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a beautiful day here in suburban Chicago. The sky is pastel blue and cloudless. The sun is out in a way that if I were going to be out for more than the 45 minutes that this walk and the next, so I'm doing 2 episodes today during my walk, would take, I would be sunburned. But I think I'll be okay with just this one walk. Yeah, so it's looking like it's going to be a great day. It will also get pretty warm, so I'm glad to be doing this walk in the morning. How are you doing, my friends? It's mid-July, the summer is halfway over. The sun is probably shining down brightly on you wherever you are. Here's hoping that it isn't too bright. For my walk today, I'm going to be doing a segment that I have decided is a 4 times a year episode, as opposed to some others that I do more frequently. This one I'm just going to do 4 times a year, and this is my reading roundup. I was originally going to call it a monthly reading roundup, but I'm reading 1 book a week, which means that it's 4 books, and not every book is maybe worth talking about for very long, so I think I'm going to do a quarterly reading roundup. I'll give you a taste of what I've been reading and just talk about the books in the order that I think they're interesting to talk about. And if I run out of time, I run out of time. So I want to start with a book to talk about. This is the book Phenomenon. I read this as part of a reading challenge from the Forgot My Dice podcast. If you aren't listening to that, go give them a listen. They're a hoot. As part of that podcast, the hosts were reading the book Phenomenon by Annie Jacobsen, which documents the 50 years between 1960 and the 30 years between 1960 and 1990 or so, maybe even a little later, in which the U.S. government, particularly through the military, was actively studying phenomena like ESP and telekinesis and remote viewing. Those are kind of the 3 main phenomena that were being studied. So going into this book, I would have very easily classified myself as someone who doesn't believe any of this is possible. It's all charlatans and frauds, and that the people who say they can do it usually have a way to make money saying they can do it and can't actually do it. And I still mostly feel that way. However, I will say some of the stuff that Jacobsen writes about in this book is so wild that it gives one pause. And here's the reason. There's a couple of reasons it gives me pause. One, Jacobsen has built a reputation as a phenomenal researcher and writer. She won the Pulitzer Prize for some of her work. Now, this doesn't mean she isn't also susceptible to writing junk. Everybody is. But it gives me pause to say I have no reason to think that, or when I think about whether to give credence to what she's written or not, you have to take into account who it is that's doing the writing. And she's someone who has earned some benefit of the doubt. That's step 1. Step 2 is the sheer volume of people that Jacobsen talked to and wrote about for this book. And of course, it could be all made up, I guess, or it could be a mix of different things. But I mean, at its heart, there's just so many people involved in talking about these things. The third part, which is on the negative side for me in terms of thinking these things are real, is that it does appear that many of the people who are supposed to be able to do this stuff are not very good at it, or they're charlatans. But not all of them. And this is the weird part. And I would say the biggest flaw in the book is that you don't get a clear sense of what the success rate is for these things. They just talk about when it's successful, it's so frightening that I worry about the Texas sharpshooter fallacy coming into play, which is the idea where you shoot an arrow at the barn and then you go paint the target on the barn after you've shot the arrow, and boom, you hit a bullseye every time. It feels a little bit like that with some of these studies, and often they're done because they're done in military secrecy. They're not done with full scientific rigor, and often when these studies are done with full scientific rigor, they then don't hold up. So I'm still pretty firmly in the doubter camp, but there's enough stuff in this book that I'm not as firmly in the doubter camp as I was before, which is interesting to me because it's not often that I feel my worldview shift that way, the way that it did in reading this book. So anyway, Phenomenon by Annie Jacobsen, worth a read. Really interesting. I read The State of the Art, which is an Ian Banks book in the Culture series. Really interesting collection of short stories and novellas. Not as good as the full-length novels that I've read so far, but pretty good, and did stoke my fire for the rest of the Culture series rather than whatever the opposite of stoking it is. Dimming, stifle, rather than stifling my power. Oh my goodness, I'm walking by a house right now, and they have a plumber company outside. It's called the Scottish Plumber, and their slogan is "The pipes are calling." And they have a tartan painting on the side and a picture of bagpipes. So if I need a plumber, I may look them up, because that is awesome. Anybody who's willing to put a pun on the side of their truck is my kind of plumber. Maybe, I don't know. All right, what else do I want to talk about that I read? I talked in the episode about Titanic themed board games. I talked about Charles Pellegrino's Farewell Titanic a couple times. That one's pretty good, worth checking out. Here's one I read on the recommendation. It's going to sound like all my reading comes from board game podcast recommendations, but whatever. On the recommendation of Cassie from the Shuffle Buddies podcast, I read The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared. This is a Swedish book, or maybe Norwegian. Swedish. It's a Swedish book that has exactly what it describes. It's this man, he lives in this old folks' home. He's still very with it and able. He's just pretty slow. And they're going to have this party for him, but he doesn't want to go to the party. He doesn't like the people at the nursing home. So he figures out that if he climbs out the window of his first floor apartment, he can go walkabout. And so that's what he does. He climbs out the window and goes walkabout. And he gets to the bus station. And while he's trying to figure out, he buys a ticket to go as far as he can in one direction. And then while he's waiting for the bus, this punk tries to go in the bathroom, but his big suitcase won't fit in the bathroom. So he yells at the old man to take the suitcase and keep an eye on it, and doesn't really ask if he will. And then the old man's bus comes, so he just takes the suitcase with him on the bus. And it turns out it's full of ill-gotten drug money, and so then these gangsters are after him. And then as the book goes along, it tells his life story of things that he did. And it's all sort of very funny. It's kind of Forrest Gump style story where he's going from place to place, seeing all these people. And yeah, it's great. A really charming story, very amusing, well worth a read, really funny. And I'd recommend. I actually watched the movie version of it as well, and it really holds up. It's not quite as good as the book, but it's really solid. So if you think the story sounds good and you don't want to commit to reading the whole book, you can check out the movie that's the same title, The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared. Yeah, really good. And that's Jonas Jonasson. I presume it's a translation to English from Swedish. I did not notice whether that was the case or if it was written in English, but yeah. The next one I want to talk about is a book I had seen recommended on Book Talk, right? If you're not on TikTok and you get into a subset of TikTok where the algorithm is recommending specific people who are making specific kind of content, then you're in that section of TikTok. For instance, Board Game Talk is a place where I am, and Book Talk is where you go if you like stuff about books and talk about books, I guess. So William Ritter has this book called Jacoby, and it is your classic modern take on the Sherlock Holmes formula. You have this character named Jacoby who is a investigator in a kind of indeterminate time. It might be the 1800s. That sounds about right. And the gimmick is that he is an investigator of supernatural things. He can see and talk to ghosts and spirits in ways that other people can't. And the main character is this sort of plucky young woman who left her family when she realized that they were just going to want her to marry and become a homemaker. She didn't want to do that, so she made her way from England to the United States, and she gets a job as Jacoby's helper. It was fine. It was a little too, I don't like to use this word because it sounds dismissive. I'll say a little too twee, by which I mean it's all sort of buttoned up very smoothly and kind of goes where you expect it will go. I don't know anything about the author, but there's a hint of the kind of Mary Sue to the character, like he's everything he needs to be and perfectly composed. And yeah, that problem sort of emerges there. I like the characters that emerge, but ultimately the book I thought was just okay, and I'm not going to read any more in the series. That's Jacoby by William Ritter. I think that's young adult fiction as well, although it's perfectly enjoyable for grown-ups. I wouldn't use that as a limiting factor myself. Next up is Last Seen Wearing. This is by Hilary Waugh. Last Seen Wearing is one of the earliest police procedural novels. It was written in the 50s. It's about a young woman who goes missing, and the police effort to find her. She goes missing from her college campus. Turns out she's been having an affair with one of the lecturers and disappeared because of that. There's an interesting sub-thread which is pretty depressing about the cops trying to figure out whether she had, because she was a young woman of college age, whether she had gone to get an abortion and the abortion went wrong and she died, and then the abortion provider hid her body. So that's really flippin' dark and entirely relevant, I'm afraid. Overall, it's good. It's interesting to see which pieces of the police procedural were kind of already there, and which pieces would, come along later as Ed McBain starts writing the 88th Precinct series, and a number of other writers kind of do this. But the whole notion of writing about police officers and their challenges in trying to conduct these investigations, and the way that the law helps or prohibits them, the kind of daily grind of trying to solve a mystery where you don't have enough clues, all of that's pretty good. I can't say I'd recommend it, though. I didn't really like it that much, and I probably wouldn't read it on my own if not for, because I was given it. All right, so The Thief is the next one I want to talk about. This is by Megan Whalen Turner. This was recommended as a book that's got some really interesting elements in it. It is a young adult fantasy novel about a thief who has to go on a journey to steal a thing on behalf of a royal house. It was good as an adventure novel. I hate to say it this way, but pretty forgettable to me. I finished the book and marked it in my Goodreads and haven't thought about it since, to the point that when I went to write this down, I had to think for a minute to try to remember what book it was. Like I literally couldn't remember the story. In part because that's a terrible title. The Thief doesn't give us a lot of room. Also on Goodreads, they say that it's part one of a series, and I did not realize it was part of a series. So when I saw that it said it was part of a series, I'm like, what series did I start? I thought it was fine. It was an enjoyable read. I definitely finished it, but I'm not going to read any more in that series. So take that for what you will. So that is most of the books that I read in the last several months. Like I said, I'm going to do one of these check-ins a quarter. So the next time you'll hear from me about my reading is in October. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. If you have been reading anything and you want to share it, you can do so over at Board Game Geek and Guild 3269. There's a link in the show notes, or you can just go boardgamegeek.com/guild/3269. If you want to send me a message directly, my username is wombat929 on Board Game Geek, or you can email me, brendan@rattleboxgames.com. I appreciate you listening, and I hope that you have a pleasant day. Thanks for joining me on walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.